how do you approach documentation, and do you have any guidelines for people on writing their own documentation for their boards or products or code?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will have to make this relatively quick because I'm running out of time.
Sure.
But I'm going to turn into a pumpkin.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I generally approach documentation in somewhat different ways depending on the audience. But when I think about writing documentation, like for my products and for tools and things like that that I want people to use, like software tools, like Gingerbread, for example, although I haven't really written documentation for that yet, is like I want the documentation itself to be something that people like to have, right? And
Yeah.
it sounds like so absurd because these days, what's the first thing you do when you open a new gadget? You immediately throw away whatever manual is with it, right? I mean,
No,
there's
I
not
put
any
them in a drawer. I put them in a drawer. There's the manuals drawer.
there's not any useful information in there anyway, so you're just gonna throw it away, right? So, I take a lot of inspiration from old video game manuals because when I grew up, because I'm a dinosaur now, the video games had instruction manuals with them, and there was a lot in there. It was like a little book. It was like a little comic book,
and the maps, the
drawings, there was so much to them. And I loved, like, as a kid, like even before I would play the game, like on the car ride home from getting a new game, and open it up, start reading the little manual. But like those are very inspiring to me because they are themselves something that you'd like to have, right? Like there's a reason people collect physical games. It's because there's all this cool stuff with it. It's like album artwork for vinyl records, right? Like you get this big, beautiful book sometimes that has like incredible photos of the bands and lyrics and stuff like that. And sometimes even like a small story or something like that behind the album. And that's kind of like what I aim for, but with technical documentation. And it's hard to get there. But if you look at things like my article on the Juno oscillator or the manuals for my products, like even a product as simple as our power supply, it's called Micronova, or a product like Speak to Me, which is literally just a speaker. You plug it in, it makes noise. Like even those, I try to make it where it's something like when you open the page, you're like, I'm happy to be looking at this. And the structure of the actual information and how I present it is very much the way that you would present instructions for how to play a video game to someone who hasn't played a video game, right? It's like, you open up the Mario manual, it's like press A to jump, and you're like, oh, okay. What next, right? Left and right to move. You're like, okay, cool. It's the same thing with my products where I'm like, okay, like you can plug in one thing here and it'll start playing some sound. If you plug in another thing, it makes it stereo. If you plug in some headphones, you can listen to it. And I include illustrations and things like that, where it's like, that's sort of inspiring to people, is to be able to kind of see visually and both, read about what they should be doing. And in the case of some of my more technical documentation that covers really complex topics, like in the Juno documentation, I break down every element of the circuit that powers the oscillator. So literally, like, why these two capacitors are here, like, why their values are what they are. Like it's stuff that's just never explained to people in most documentation. And the way that I explain it is I let you play with the values. I give you, a slider and an interactive thing that shows you what happens as you change the parameters, like, of this circuit, right? If you, lower the capacitance, what happens to this filter? If you increase the resistance, what happens, right? As you change the voltage going in, what happens? And all of this is interactive and like visual and illustrative. And it's something that even if you're reading it for the first time and you're not fully understanding it, you get a sense for what's going on. And it's a joy to actually interact with. So it'll get you to come back. It'll get you to actually sit with the material and understand it. And that's like really what my brain thinks about when I think about documentation, is giving people practical ways of understanding what's happening and what's going on, and presenting it with a level of attention and beauty and, you know, a little bit of flair, like a video game manual, that you want to, you know, you want to actually read it. So yeah, because the number one rule when it comes to technical documentation is that nobody reads. So, you know.
I've read a lot of the RP2040 SDK and that SAMD datasheet, right?
Yeah, and the thing is like when it comes to writing reference documentation instead of like, you know, more guided documentation, I have a completely different approach. And you know, I think a big thing is knowing your audience and knowing what you want your audience to accomplish with your documentation. Because someone who is, you know, trying to figure out how to, you know, change the I2C speed doesn't really care about a guided tutorial on how to configure I2C from the start, right? They already got that. They just want to change something. So that's a reference, and you need to make that a completely different experience for them.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so I would say, you know, if you're going to write documentation, first thing you should do is just write something. Most people don't write, so yeah, write something. The next thing is get other people to look at it, because other people will tell you if it sucks, and you can use that to improve. The third thing is that if you really want it to be amazing, hire a technical writer or a technical editor, because they can really help you, and they're not that expensive. And when it comes to making sure your product is successful or your open source project, you know, really takes off, they can make the difference, you know?